Welcome to Unity Now, the podcast where we discuss unity in the face of division. Inspired by the Unity 2020 plan, we strive to unite Americans by highlighting the middle ground between the two dominant parties and promoting the individual over groups. Each episode, we will bring you exciting, well-informed guests and host nuanced conversations about politically charged subjects. Our goal is to bring an end to the ideological war threatening the collective well-being of this great country.
Welcome back to the Unity Now podcast. I'm your host, Toby Davis, and today I have the distinct pleasure of being joined by Julie Winokur, Director of Talking Eyes Media and producer and director of Bring It to the Table. Hey, Julie.
Hey there. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for taking the time tonight. We wanted to sit down with you as your project, Bring It to the Table, and your media company, Talking Eyes Media, relates, we think, in large part to our podcast and where its roots come from. So if you could give the audience and listeners a brief background or, go as long as you want to introduce yourself and kind of what brought you to developing Talking Eyes Media and Bring It to the Table.
Sure. So Talking Eyes Media is a nonprofit production company. And so we produce documentary films, photo essays, exhibitions, online websites. And I come out of the mainstream media world. I had worked at magazines. I was a writer originally. And I hit a wall where I felt like the media was part of the problem rather than the solution. I sort of felt that the media was perpetuating I don't know. Honestly, it's a for-profit media. It has to get eyeballs. It has to be dramatic, even when things are not dramatic. It has to perpetuate certain myths in order to please audience. And I always felt like the media is, it's a powerful tool. I mean, honestly, it's something that you should have in your arsenal so that you can actually impact human beings, human thinking,
Yeah.
And so I felt that I didn't want to be part of the media as is. I wanted to make sure that I created storytelling that I thought was really in service to positive social change, whatever that looks like, And so I set up the company. It's now 18 years ago. It's a while. Set it up as a nonprofit media outlet, which was a bit of an oxymoron at the time because that just wasn't a thing. It's become more of a thing,
Yeah.
And really thinking that the only way to be able to do in-depth storytelling, long form, over a long period of time was going to be through grants and support, that was not going to come from mainstream media. And that also half of what I do is a lot of outreach. So it's not just making the media, it's also figuring out how do you put media to work? How do you actually get it in front of people and engage with them in a direct, hands-on kind of way? And so that's what I've been doing for the last 18 years is projects that are, kind of unique in the media space. So fast forward to Bring It to the Table, which is actually a project that I launched quite a few years ago. It's now over 9 years ago. It was during the Obama administration, and I was feeling very frustrated with the toxic political environment. It was a time where we were looking at Congress getting virtually nothing done. There was a lot of opposition to the Obama administration from the right. There was this an unraveling of the process, it felt like, in D.C. And I felt like it was actually infecting all of us, that, whether we were driving it or whether we were reacting to it, there was such hostility between right and left. And so I had been thinking about, God, this is a terrible environment. This is un-American, really, what's going on. And I was trying to figure out how might I bring together people from different sides and get them to have honest conversations and whatnot. And so while I'm having all this kind of high-minded thinking, my 17-year-old son at the table in our kitchen one morning, he says to me, "Mom, you are the most politically intolerant person I've ever met." I was like, "Me? what? Like, how's that possible?
Yeah.
And he said, when it comes to politics, if the other side had a good idea, you wouldn't even know because you weren't listening. And it was that moment of like having to really stop externalizing all of what I was thinking and internalize it and really examine my own behavior, put the mirror up to my own self and say, am I part of the problem? You know, if I'm feeling so angry at the political other and I'm not even able to listen and hear what somebody with different viewpoints has to say, then I need to start at home. I need to start with me before I can kind of go out and preach, you know?
Yeah.
And it was a watershed moment, you know, and sometimes it takes that. It takes someone that you love, someone you trust, you know, someone who sees you in your raw and perhaps most unflattering self to stop and have a perspective shift. And that's exactly what happened for me. So when he said that, I thought, you know, he's probably right. You know, we are avid news junkies, my husband and I. We read the paper at the kitchen table every morning. We watch the news. We try to keep on top of things. But we definitely have our biases, you know. And so I decided that I needed to actually go out and learn how to listen. And so I was talking with a friend one day, and we kind of started shooting ideas back and forth, like, how do you do that? Where do you go? You know, and she said, boy, you know, we've been talking about how you wanted to do something where you would go to like other people's dinner tables so you could hear them be open and frank. Well, what if you brought your table to them? And it was one of those moments where it just all came together. It was like, you know, that's it. I'm going to actually go out with my table because I can't go sit at their dinner tables. I'm going to take my table out and I'm going to invite people to sit and talk politics. And the whole goal is to learn how to listen and learn how to open up my own ability to empathize with people whom, you know, I have rejected, you know?
Yeah.
And it's a hard thing to do. It's a really challenging thing to do. It's uncomfortable. It's, you know, there are times that you feel like you're growing, and there are other times where you feel like, you know what, there's nothing you're saying that's really registering for me in my world.
Yeah.
And when I started the project, I thought that I might build the project on the concept that, like, if I sat across from you, I would ask you, what is the one question you really genuinely want to ask someone on the other side to try to understand? And I thought I would sort of build the whole process off of those questions, you know, let them sort of be crowdsourced. And as time went on, what was so apparent is, like, I couldn't be the impartial listener. I had to also be able to say, well, here's, you know, what I have seen, or here's what I think, because otherwise it's not a genuine exchange. But it was learning how to do that in a way that was not confrontational, that was more of an invitation. And so, you know, just for anybody who's not seen Bring It to the Table, it resulted, the interviews that I did, the conversations I did, I traveled the country with a crew because I make films. And I produced a film called Bring It to the Table, which then, you know, like we had materials that were ready to share, you know, as, you know, election season came around again, because it took us, we did feed some during the Obama's second election. We did feed some to the media, but then spent the next couple of years just editing and doing more traveling and processing all of this and figuring out, how do you turn a bunch of conversations into a story? You know, how do you make that a journey somebody else wants to go on?
Right.
So we ultimately cut a 40-minute film. And then I started sharing that film and doing live presentations, post-screening discussions, you know, having the film become a tool for engaging with people to talk about this process. And so feel free to cut me off at any point, but it was quite a long journey, you know, to get to where we are today. And so I ended up one day, I was doing a live presentation, and I would bring my table with me as a sort of prop, just to kind of say, this is the table, this has been on the road, it's been all over the country, it's been through 125 filmed conversations. And so I said, it would be really interesting to have a conversation. Anybody in the audience want to volunteer and sit at the table with me? And so this woman put her hand up. So I was like, great, come on up. And so she sits down and we have this conversation. And then after the conversation, she sat back down and I started talking more about the process and about, what I had learned and everything like that. And then another hand went up. And I said, yes, you, what would you like to know? And this person said, are you going to have more people sit at the table? Because I want to sit at the table.
Oh, wow.
And I was shocked because I never thought people would want to do it in front of an audience. And so I looked at everybody and I said, are there other people here who would like to sit at the table? And about 5 more hands went up. And so it was this moment, again, it's, like you have those epiphany moments where I thought, people really want to talk and they aren't afraid to talk openly in front of strangers if you set the table properly, if you set the tone and you say that, this is all about a respectful exchange and you're here to be heard. It's amazing that politics is not a taboo subject if it's done in a way that can be authentic. I realized that what I was aiming for and what I was having glimpses of were people being given an opportunity to be more authentic in processing what they think and believe that translates into political identity. And so since that day, I have been doing these live engagements with people where we watch the film, I talk a little bit about it, and then I have volunteers from the audience come up and sit at the table, and we have these live exchanges in front of an audience. And then I started to do something where the entire audience would then, I'd give them the format, we'd talk about, my practice, my methodology, and then I would give them prompts and they would turn to somebody in the auditorium and they would have table talks with each other. And then we reconvene and talk about what that's like. So it's gone through these iterations from one woman's personal experience to this kind of pebble in a pond ripple effect of encouraging other people to be able to have a different kind of conversation and to learn how to listen in a way that I am still learning how to listen.
Yeah, that's very fascinating. And I think in studying for our discussion today, I think I learned most of that. But I thank you for going through all that because I want the audience to hear it from your perspective and your background. And I think just listening to you go through it yourself, I have questions. The first 5 people, you said that the original discussion that you had live after screening the film, you had a couple people and then you asked for hands and 5 more people raised their hands. In that original one, were any of those people wanting to speak because did they just want to offer a reaction to what they had heard someone else say already? Or were they genuinely just wanting to, have a discussion, kind of espouse their own points and have a calm discussion?
So it's a bit of both. There were definitely people who, really wanted to share, they're perhaps more extroverted. They wanted to share what they had to say.
Yeah.
What's interesting is I don't think anybody who sits at the table knows fully where the conversation will take them. I apologize, my email is making noise. I don't know if you can hear that, but I'm going to quit out of email so it stops pinging.
Oh, you're fine, yeah. I can't hear it.
Okay, sorry about that.
No, you're popular, obviously.
No, junk mail. Aren't we all? What's interesting is, some folks that get up there because they'd heard what someone else said, so they felt like, well, I really want to express what I think about this topic.
Yeah.
But the format of the table talks doesn't allow you to really just go off on a tangent and start to get your soapbox out and pontificate. It just discourages that. And also in a lot of these live presentations, I'm sitting opposite somebody, so I'm also very conscious of bringing them back down to earth and getting them to talk about their personal experiences, because I'm really keen on having people identify what they genuinely know and are qualified to speak about. And often, we all do this. We speak in bumper stickers. We regurgitate whatever we heard the CNN anchor say or the Fox commentator say. And what happens is you end up hearing the same phrases over and over again, right? This is not your choice of language. It's somebody else's choice of language. And so what I work very hard at with Bring It to the Table is like, I'm so determined to get us to recognize what we really think and where perhaps we're just regurgitating somebody else's thought. And I think that's the place that we need desperately to focus as citizens, because we're all being manipulated and we all think we're informed based on who we trust as our source of information. And we're coming to a place where we then almost don't trust anything, and we don't trust anyone who doesn't agree with what we now hold to be true. And so what I try really hard to do is get us back to, like, I've had incidences where, like, I would set up the table and you invite somebody to sit down at the table, and we all do this. You size up kind of who you think you're talking to.
Yeah.
You look at this one guy and you're sort of like, oh, I think I got his number. I know what he's going to say. And it's constantly happening where somebody then just blows you away. They said things that you had no idea that person would think that. They had experienced that, what they share with you. And so, like, that would happen with regularity, and so, I'm so used to hearing people kind of give the welfare, like, well, government programs are just enabling, all these lazy people, and I don't want my hard-earned money to go towards that. So this one guy sits down at the table. I'm at a county fair in North Carolina. He's a really kind of nice, middle of the road kind of guy.
Yeah.
And he says to me, well, welfare programs, I'm not so keen on, spending all that money. And so, in Bring It spirit, I said to him, so why do you think that? Have you, what's your personal experience around welfare? Like, do you know anybody who's been on welfare? What makes you say that? And he says, well, I was raised on welfare. And then he started to talk about his own experience, about his mother kind of milking the system. And so when he's sharing that with me, and I'm kind of going, okay, okay, you have an experience I don't have, that you can educate me what you saw firsthand. And so I now have a different opinion about absorbing and accepting your opinion on this topic. So those are the moments of your breakthrough, of you're saying, okay, I'm not going to assume that you don't know what you're talking about, because now you have an authority to tell me about something.
And not only did you, showcase that conversation, and if I'm right, I know what you're talking about, the part in the film, you actually then split it side by side with someone with kind of the same background, but then that person does believe in the welfare system, and they believe in how much it helped them and how much, it helps other people, versus someone else who was raised on it but doesn't believe in it. Well, no, I'm sorry.
Right.
Maybe I'm flipping those. One person was raised on it, one was not, but one...
They both, right.
Yeah, and they both had single mothers. Both were brought up with their mother raising them alone. One was on welfare, one was not. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, yep.
Yeah. And so you showcase those two very different experiences, which again boils down to personal experience, personal beliefs, and not what they're just repeating.
Right. Because I get really tired. I don't know about you, but I'm really tired of people pretending they're authorities on things they know nothing about firsthand. I can't speak to certain experiences because
Yeah, exactly. And you're right. And I had my own experience with this. So you talked about how you started during the Obama campaign and you were concerned about how much of the right disliked Obama. And I was in that camp. I was Team Red at the time. I was, and I didn't like Obama because he was the other team. And that's pretty much the only reason. And once I kind of came out of that shell and discovered this whole team concept is a bad idea from the get-go, and it's much worse than a bad idea. Then I started to look at, what do I believe? And then it came down to, it really depends on what we're talking about. And there are so many things I have no idea about the issue because I haven't experienced it. So I would have to study it and talk to other people.
Yeah.
That seems common nature, like it'd be common anyone's approach to any kind of topic, but it's not anymore, right? It's probably what you find a lot where people are just repeating what they say. And how much of that, it's interesting that you started Talking Eyes Media before social media was really a big thing. Is that right?
Yeah, before it existed, actually.
Yeah, before it existed. So it's interesting that you had that thought to start an independent source of information long before we had these algorithms piling us all into our echo chambers even more than we were already. Because back then people would, like you said, they would tune into Fox News or they would tune into CNN, and that was their echo chamber along with where they lived, who they surrounded themselves with, their maybe people they work with, their friends, their family. But then we piled on technology on top of that, and we gave them access to Facebook friends and groups and places to follow, and then the algorithms changed the news feeds, and now it was even a bigger problem. How did you see that shift, when social media really started to take hold in the mid-2010s?
Social media is it's such a complex beast. And in some ways, it's a Frankenstein of our own design. Obviously, it's an amazing moment because people can share. Everybody's a publisher, right? Everybody has an instant audience if you want it. So there's some incredible, rich and fertile opportunities with social media.
Yeah.
On the flip side, as we've seen, it's been used to great detriment. And so it's alarming. Like when I started doing Bring It to the Table, I really thought things were bad. I had no idea how much worse they would get. And this also predates the whole Cambridge Analytics and all the stuff that went on that we've come to recognize, and manipulation from foreign sources of our social media feeds. And this stuff is undeniable. This is not conspiracy theory. This is, there are footprints, there are fingerprints, all over what's been happening. And I don't doubt that we do it in other countries as well. I don't doubt that the U.S. has its hands in foreign elections.
Right.
So this isn't just some sort of bogeyman Russian plot or some such. I think this is the new cyber warfare, the moment that we're living in. So I think it's incredibly dangerous, the way social media has morphed. That said, it's, again, there are many phenomenal things that it's provided to people, and access to being able to share and spread information that is valuable. But it makes it very complicated for people to decipher. Super complicated. And I'm sure that you can relate, and anybody who's listening can relate, where you will see posts on social media from friends who you think are going off the deep end, or family members. We've had family members sharing things recently. The pandemic has certainly brought a lot of this out, I think, because people are home and they're on their computers way more than is healthy. But this is a moment where if we could talk a little bit about COVID and what's gone on, and vaccines and the debate now over vaccines and the mask or anti-mask. It's shocking to me that when you have something that is seemingly nonpartisan, a pandemic, that we can't all look at this thing just as humans and figure out how do we deal as humans, rather than the absurd politicizing that's gone on. So, to me, this is the allegory of all time. How poorly we're dealing with COVID.
Right. I mean, in some ways, I was shocked as you were to the point of how politicized it became. But then when I really sat down and thought about it, I thought, well, why would I be surprised? Like, everything else is politicized right up until that point, right? I think we were ending the impeachment around that time, right? When the pandemic happened. So why wouldn't that also be politicized?
Because our lives are all on the line. Because, that's what's shocking to me. This
Right.
isn't poor versus rich, black versus white, men versus women. Everything about it was like, this thing doesn't know skin. Well, I mean, it knows skin color in the sense that clearly there's a disparity in the deaths, and that's also about economics. It's about, health outcomes. It's access to healthcare. It's all kinds of things. Density of living conditions, environmental stressors, and whatnot. But disease is something that again, it's killing young people and old people. It's killing all of us. So. What's interesting also is, I've become fascinated by history in a way that I think when I was younger it seemed boring. But you look at, the 1918 flu, the influenza, and you see the recurrence of history almost like interchangeable. And it's sort of alarming how little we've advanced. When it comes down to it, in our thinking, our ability to just take care of a problem in a unified way, it's quite disappointing.
That's a good point. I'm curious, like how was it politicized? Basically, like we saw the
there were anti-maskers back then too. There were photographs of anti-maskers. It was There were conspiracy theories. Again, the whole idea of trying to point a finger to and calling this the Spanish flu. There were, so many of the sort of the echo of what happened then, is there. And what's interesting too, I read something about how they think it's possible that Woodrow Wilson had actually gotten influenza, and that when he went to Europe, he was actually sick and probably delirious when he negotiated with the Europeans about how to deal with Germany. And we ended up paying a pretty dear price, for the, the lack of support ultimately to help Germany recuperate after the war and be reintegrated into with other European nations and have some voice. So they think that there's a correlation potentially between Woodrow Wilson's mental state and what ended up happening.
That's fascinating. I had not heard about that. I've delved a lot into Nazi Germany in the past few years, just trying to understand that thin line of good and evil that falls between both of us, kind of where I learned that concept. And that's, I know what you're talking about. So the society really took a downturn after World War I and left a gap for somebody to fill. Mm-hmm. So you're saying that potentially Woodrow Wilson's state from infection with influenza was a factor there, right?
Yes.
One of the variants of
Apparently.
the problem. That's crazy. Yeah. Were the sides the same? Were the anti-masker, well, let me ask you right now, if you had to say politically where they lean, anti-maskers are right or left?
Oh, now in the United States?
Yeah.
Oh, the anti-maskers, I think, are decidedly right.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I don't. Is that debatable or?
I think so. I try to do what you do, and I try not to pin anybody or any concepts politically one way or the other. And I try never to say I'm on a particular team or it depends on the concept. So I just wanted to confirm that before I ask the next question. Did you find in that study of the influenza outbreak, were they the same teams? Were they anti-maskers, the conservatives?
That's an excellent question, and I don't want to say anything out of turn because, again, I don't want to say something that may not be accurate. But there's definitely I'm going to guess yes, only because the anti-mask mindset is very much about personal freedom and not thinking in a communitarian way. That's just by its nature, that's what it is. I should be able to do what I want, and I don't want my government telling me what to do, right? That's the basis, that's the argument of an anti-masker. Whereas the kind of common sense mask, ideology is just that I wear this to help everybody, because what if I'm contagious? I don't want to infect you. It's not just about me. It's about the fact that we all have to look out for each other. So My government is asking me to do this, but I choose to do this because it's what's best for us.
Right. Yeah. And you're right. It's very silly to liken that to any kind of restriction of freedom. There's not like there's armed guards sitting at every corner checking your mask. So put it on. You'll be fine. My family and I just traveled to St. Louis last week for spring break. We wore our masks. We respected their policies in every business and every place we went, but we traveled. We got out of our house. We were able to see, a different part of the country we don't see, and everyone, got along for the most part. Mm-hmm. And the whole time, and everyone got along, and we had freedom to do that, and we wore our masks. We survived.
Yep. This is a minimal imposition. To wear a mask is a minimal imposition. They're not asking you to get, a vasectomy or something. They're, honestly.
Right. So I'm still fascinated, I think, by how long ago you created, the media company and separated yourself from mainstream media. What led you to do that exactly back then? If you could take us back a little bit.
So I had started a project. This is back in actually the mid 90s. I started a project with my husband as a photojournalist, and we worked together a lot. We had started a project that was about aging in America, and it was looking at an aging society because the statistics were showing that as the baby boomers aged, for the first time in history, we were going to have more old people than young people in the country. And statistically, that's supposed to happen by 2040, I believe, something like that. I forget now, 2030, 2040. And so we decided to start reporting on what does an aging society look like. And so we started to do stories about geriatric wards in prisons and older people getting married in their 80s. Stories that we were able to place in media outlets, but it was one-off and one-off and one-off. And we wanted to do something that was going to be really a survey that was going to take years to do, and that was deep reporting. And so at that point, I started to look for grants to support the project. That project is really what launched Talking Eyes Media. We spent 7 years covering topics around aging, because we also felt like this is a revolution that's happening socially, and we're not prepared necessarily to deal with what that means, to have an elderly majority population. And so once I started to do that, and once I started to think about what is required to do that depth of reporting over time, what was clear is that you are never going to find support from the mainstream media to do that kind of nuanced storytelling. It's just they don't use the resource that way, and it's a big lift. So that was really the turning point for Talking Eyes, and why I founded Talking Eyes, as a way to be able to support what I felt was substantive storytelling. What became clear to me over the years, though, it's one thing to make media, it's another to distribute it and make sure that it gets to its intended audience, and that there's a quality of an experience with media that you don't have the same numbers, you don't have the quantity of people, but the quality of the experience is deep. And so a lot of our media ends up being used by universities, colleges, high schools. A lot is used by grassroots organizations that deal with different issues that we report on. We've had our media used by legislators or seen by legislators to, help clarify what's at stake on the ground.
Yeah.
We're in a privileged position because we get to actually meet people in their homes, and live with them for a short time, walk a little distance with them, and then bring that experience to folks who don't get to leave their offices a whole lot.
Had you tried to or attempted to bring it to any kind of mainstream companies and was turned down, or did you already foresee it wasn't going to be possible at all?
It depends. I mean, our stuff goes to mainstream. We've had our projects on National Geographic and PBS and MSNBC, and there used to be a documentary channel. So our media does go there. New York Times has run a lot of pieces of ours, Time Magazine. So we do all of that as well. And especially, back to what you were saying before, social media, not just social media, but just the fact that the internet allows us to reach millions of people with our work, even though it might not be a prescribed length, or it might not fit into a weekly program. We're able to produce things and still get it out through the internet so it gets seen widely. But for me, it's exciting when something's published online. It's exciting when National Geographic runs one of our films.
Yeah.
But that's only one piece of it. It's one piece of it, because you may or may not have been paying attention when it was on, or you might have watched the first 5 minutes and then decided to do something else, or who knows what. I can't really gauge if I've touched you if I just broadcast a film. But I can gauge if I touched you if there's a discussion afterwards. If it's in a classroom and the teacher then has an assignment where everybody's writing a paper about what spoke to them in the film. And I receive those kinds of, that kind of feedback I get regularly.
Yeah, so it seems like maybe it's a lost art or maybe it's a new art. I'm not sure, but the fact that you really are invested in the touch that you get on your projects and what you have put your time into in covering long form sources of information that take up to 7 years to divulge or kind of expose. That's very interesting. And that's what bringing it to the table is, right? It's where you weren't just interested in, well, here's the film, post it on your website, post it on social media, and to go see it and thanks and work on your next project. You were really concerned about bringing that message to people's homes. Like you wanted to actually have that conversation past the film. Obviously the film, you traveled the country and sat down with people, but then even after this, and I think this is part of what I wanted to ask you too, did you have to stop the Bring It to the Table project with the pandemic? I think you obviously had to, right?
Yeah, I stopped traveling with it, but we have done some online sessions. Okay. So that's been super interesting. Yeah. So let me share a little bit too, because the project, it's interesting. You start a project and you have no idea, you're not thinking about the end game. You're just, you're kind of pulled along because you're passionate and curious, and that also you're tapping into the ethos of the moment. Mm-hmm. And so when the film was done, and I started to do all of these presentations, and portions of the film have been broadcast, so it's been repurposed in many ways. But what happened was I started doing all of these live events and traveled to exhaustion. Really, it was a lot. It was a lot because the film also tends to ride the election cycle. It rides that. There's a lot of interest as we ramp up to an election, and then it goes quiet because everybody's exhausted.
Right.
So it's a film that honestly, by the time 2016 rolled around, I was traveling nonstop. And when the election came, I had an impact producer. She and I were talking about, okay, like, did it? This was like the most patriotic thing I've ever done in my life. I've done it. I was a good citizen. I got out there. I engaged with all these people, and I'm so done now. And then the election happened. And the day after the election, and I think we were all surprised, with the outcome. I mean, right and left, I think there was a moment of like collective confusion, you know. Right. It just didn't seem like that was the outcome that was slated, Right. And my impact producer and I are sitting across from each other, and we said, what do we do now? What do we do now? And it was just one of those moments where it's like, I'm so tired. Like I've done this for years now, but we need it even more now, which proved to be true. Right. I whatever you think of Donald Trump, he definitely was not a peacemaker, So, and then the Washington Post did a story about me because all of a sudden everybody, not everybody, a lot of people suddenly said, oh, who knew that we were so divided as a nation? Who knew that we were not tuned into the same channel? Well, if you're paying attention, you should have known, but it was a surprise to many. And so all of these people started to find me because they started Googling, like, I don't know what they were Googling, but my name was popping up. And so the Washington Post did a piece on me and my phone just started ringing off the hook. And it was people saying, like, we have a problem in this country. We aren't talking to each other. And you've been doing this for years, this bring it to the table thing. And we want to bring you here because we need tools. We don't quite know what to do. And so all of a sudden I was, rather than being able to sort of, put it in the rear view mirror, it ended up amping up a lot. And so what I did over the last couple of years, we started to do 10-table events where I would train facilitators, and then they would set up tables in a public space, and they would do the table talks and invite people to sit down. And then I've had some places that have just, used our model, used our questions, and and have then developed, like I get packets of material sometimes from people saying, here are the questions we developed, and here are the topics that we've done, and here are the surveys we created, and here's how our community responded. So I'm starting to get that. What I had always hoped would happen would be, that you sort of build a movement that folks can take on their own. And it's, it was never about me. It was never intended to be my story. Right. It was always intended to be something that's like for anybody and everybody, that this is something you can do. Yeah, again, I think those people share the same reaction I have, hearing that you started so long ago, and it's like you were way ahead of the problem, or you just saw the problem much earlier and it's only gotten worse. But it's encouraging to hear that people reached out and, wanted your help to bring that. Do you fear at all ever that, you are trying to bring calm to the storms? You're trying to bring alternative sources of media. Do you ever fear that you would be canceled in a way, or big tech wouldn't allow even your website to come up on a search or anything like that? Does that ever, cross your mind? No, actually that doesn't, because I think, when you're trying to, when you're carrying the flag of civil discourse, I think people think you're just so naive, they're not worried about you. On some level, I think they just sort of feel like you're harmless. Because especially when other people, have their boxing gloves on, I think on some level they're kind of like, good, we don't have to worry about you,
Well, it's interesting. We so Unity now we came from the Unity 2020 movement, which had a website, had a Twitter, Articles of Unity handle, and during one of the debates in 2020, we got a hashtag trending, "Just Say No to Donald and Joe." And many of the people that were putting that on Twitter were accused of being Russian bots. And then Twitter outright banned the account. To this day, has not been restored. So, so we weren't just the ones that they said, "Oh, they're just making a little noise." It's not as if the Twitter account had millions of followers either. It, was relatively small in the Twitter landscape. Obviously, Twitter itself is a sort of a Thunderdome sort of experience at times. So that's may not be the best example, but that movement experienced, I think, the exact opposite of what you just mentioned.
And ironically, I think if you had millions of followers, they might not have shut you down so soon because, this is the dirty little secret about how these companies behave. Because if you're driving a lot of traffic, it's not necessarily in their interest to shut you down too quickly.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good point. And so you mentioned that this exercise of bring it to the table, it wasn't about you, but that's where it kind of started, right, with your son's observation. Have you two talked since then about how he sees you now? Are you any more tolerant than you were back then in his eyes?
Well, there's a point in the film where I ask him that, and he's like, you're trying, you'll get there, He appreciates that I've definitely come a long way, that I keep some impulses in check and I kind of will ask to learn more. But I also think that the process taught me a whole lot about, my own convictions. Yeah. And I don't think anybody should be swayed from having beliefs,
right.
and we're not meant to all be wired the same. I mean, the beauty of the process we have is the push and pull of ideas. So I was never kind of hoping to neuter, people's convictions, but certainly hoping to, learn how to become more informed, more nuanced, and to give somebody else an opportunity to share and genuinely be open to hearing what they have to say rather than prejudging. This is a lifelong process. And I will still catch myself at times going, oh yeah, that's the old me. I just heard her again. She popped her head out. There she is, But certainly a lot better. I had an incident one night where my daughter played soccer and we were on the road with a soccer team, and I ended up being the only left-leaning parent in a whole conversation at night, like around the bar, right? And I didn't really know everybody's political leaning, but this conversation ended up, getting somewhat ugly,
Okay, yeah.
It was just interesting. It was one of those where, one woman sort of went off the handle. This was, again, Obama era, and she just was like, what kind of idiot would vote for Obama, right? She started with one of those. And I just, me being me, and I was doing my project. And so I don't believe in letting those things lie either, because then people feel like it's okay to think that way, speak that way, And this is a problem that's happened even more so in the last 4 years, that I do feel that Trump was instrumental in giving permission or celebrating that kind of behavior, that kind of dismissal of other people.
Yeah.
And so I spoke up, I said, well, this idiot, twice, and it was one of those conversations of like, oh, well, how could you possibly? And then I got the litany of how he was the worst president ever. And I was just sort of like, well, I don't really think he's, the worst president ever. And, and here's kind of why.
Yeah.
So we got in this conversation, at which point there was a lot of attrition. A lot of people were like, I'm not getting in that conversation. And there was like, everybody distanced. It was like the sea parted,
Crowd separated. Yeah.
And I ended up with 3 other parents talking till probably 2 in the morning. And we had this great conversation about the stimulus package and about, the Recovery Act and how that money got spent. And, and we ended up on healthcare and the ACA and all kinds of conversations that were really compelling, where they had certain expertise that I learned from. I had expertise they learned from. And the next morning, these moms came up to me and they just said, I just want to say, I'm so impressed with how you handled that last night, because it could have been like really hostile and you just didn't let it go there, and it just, we're really impressed. And I just thought, if nothing else, that was a bring it victory.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this was after Bring It to the Table had become your project? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you think you would have had the same reaction before that project? The same kind of reaction to what?
Oh, no. No. I think before the project, I would have been, and God, we've all been there where you're like telling the other person how many ways they're wrong, No, you got it all wrong because of this and this and this. And, and don't you read,
Yeah. Right.
So there was none of that. There was none of that because it was sort of like, okay, I've heard what you're saying, but, I may not have read that study you're talking about. But what I do know is what I've witnessed. I've sat with people dying who don't have health insurance, and I can tell you all about what that means. So if you want to have a conversation about access to health care, this conversation happened to have been with a guy who wrote a health policy for a large consulting firm. And it was all about free market healthcare, and it was all about, HSAs, health savings accounts, and he was all about, the free market fixing the healthcare system. And it was like, well, that's all well and good for your big corporation of very high earners. But let me tell you what I've witnessed on the ground, and I've done a lot of coverage on access to healthcare. So I will tell you what it's like to sit in that room, and, and that's kind of what we have. We're not having the same conversation when we talk about healthcare reform.
Yeah. And me in my former Team Red state would have said to you back then, well, those people just need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They need to work hard. They need to go get their own health care, right? But as you point out in your conversations with actual people, nothing is ever as simple as that. And you've had those experiences. I have not had those experiences, but now at least I realize those type of people exist. And there's a conversation to be had at the very least.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And in the same way that I was able to learn, one of the people in the discussion, she was actually a mortgage broker, home mortgages. And so she was talking about all the money that, had been spent to try to bail folks out who had taken these lousy mortgages. But from her perspective, she said the way the administration utilized that money, she said, I've had clients for years who were now underwater and didn't want to lose their homes and wanted to pay, but because of the way it was all structured at that time, the only way they could deal with anything related to their mortgage was to go through a government agency. So they took away this direct relationship with the mortgage broker on the ground in the community. And she was no longer able to help them navigate so they could keep their home. So they had to go into arrears for months before they were able to renegotiate these mortgages. So she said, this is the most absurd policy. That's the failure of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
Right? So when I heard that, I thought, you know what? You're totally right. And I didn't know that about, this type of, a government misstep, that I can understand why you might look and say, what a failed policy.
Yeah, you hit it right there. I mean, the conversations with real people and not just on social media screaming at each other in as little words as possible, seeking out individuals and seeking out the individual in yourself. Like, that's how we're going to get out of where we are. Mm-hmm. So your project, I think, and your companies are very honorable in this pursuit. And that's why we wanted to have you on. We want to highlight these type of efforts and projects. And I couldn't tell people more to go to your websites, seek out seek out the films, seek out the projects, invite. Do you think you're going to be able to go out to people again in real life? Depends on each states and.
Yeah, depends. And, in the meantime, I'm always open to doing online versions or supplying our material so people can do their own events and all that. So I have a burning question for you is, what was your turning point? You keep saying when I was Team Red. So what happened for you? What's the transition?
It's a good question. I've tried to kind of dive into that myself many times, and it was something to do with... So I voted for Trump 2016. I admit that. I've admitted that plenty of times on here. And it was, again, Team Red, got to defeat Hillary, Team Blue. And I celebrated when he was elected. But then shortly thereafter, in the months and the couple of years to follow, I saw wow, that didn't help at all. What's gotten better? We're still yelling at each other. We're still screaming at each other. And I think, stumbled onto some people on YouTube, which eventually led me to the so-called intellectual dark web. So the Jordan Petersons, the Brett Weinsteins, Eric Weinsteins, at the time, Dave Rubin, all these guys that were having these kind of conversations, and they were showing how you could speak on very important topics and you could disagree or agree, but it took a discussion to really get to any sort of truth or any kind of way you could change your mind, or you could strengthen your own position, whatever it may be. And I really started to kind of look at myself and say, well, do I actually believe everything? Am I really a Republican? Do I believe everything that every Republican believes? Which then you have to ask other questions like, well, what does every Republican believe? Well, that's not a thing either. And then you go further and say, well, I'm just me. I'm just Toby. I'm not on a team. There are things I lean conservative, and now I think there are things I lean liberal or progressive even. And I think every issue needs nuance. It needs a discussion. And until you have that, I will never tell you how I lean, and I will never tell you what team I'm on, because I'm not on a team. And I've tried to make that point to do that. And that's kind of what brought me into this movement and onto this podcast team. So it took years.
Yeah, that's beautiful. It's beautiful. And it takes a lot of courage to break out from these kind of monikers, this sort of identity, because we're all wrapped up in our identity. And so something that you have always identified as, it takes a lot of courage to say, wait a minute, in some way it's like when you're a kid trying to say, I'm not my parents, it's sort of like I've got to be able to push back and say, I need to find my own way.
Yeah, and people so in the Unity 2020 movement, it was always called the red pill moment, the awakening, those sort of things. And that's why it's fascinating to hear your story. It seems as though you had your red pill moment, many, many years ago. Or at least it's never a moment, obviously. It's never like a flash of light, or you wake up one morning and all of a sudden you see the light. It's never anything like that, obviously. But you at least started on that path. I think if I had to kind of grade it, talking to you way back in 2002 when you launched Talking Eyes Media.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I've never thought of it in that perspective, so I appreciate that. I often think about why do we do what we do? What is that? And bringing it to the table is always digging for this too. It's the what deep-rooted experiences have some people wanting one type of leader over another? What has some people upset with immigrants and others defending immigrants? What has some people, welfare, on and on and on down the chart? Why do some people have more faith in government, and why do some people have more faith in corporations? So if you stop and ask yourself these questions, like, why am I wired that way? And when did that start showing itself? And how much was taught to me? How much have I learned and unlearned in my life? And these are really complicated questions. And they're hard to answer. Like, I do think a lot about, like, why, I've grown up comfortably. So why am I passionate about those who have less? I don't need to make that my life's effort. It's not my life. I'm not fighting on the front lines through lived experience, that sort of thing. So why?
Exactly. Every time I hear this, so like Clubhouse is a big thing now. I don't know if you're on there, but even there you start to hear people throw out all these words like conservative, liberal, progressive, the teams they're on, the groups they're on, the ideologies they're in. And I always want to jump in and say, why? Like, who put you on that team? Why are you in that group? Why do you believe in that ideology? Because if you really stopped and asked yourself those things, I don't know that you would know the answer. I think you would take a step back and say, well, I don't know. Like, that's a good question. But so many people can't hear those questions. And I think that's one of the big problems that you're tackling with Bring It to the Table.
And the big thing is to get people to self-examine.
Yeah.
Because when people sit at my table, they learn about themselves when they talk, sure, because they're having to reason through, why do you believe that? What did you see? What's the foundational experience? So yeah, they're learning something about themselves. But I think people learn a lot more about themselves when they listen. Hands down, when you are forced to be the listener, when you are forced to actually enter a conversation in the spirit that everybody has something to teach you, that's the expansive moment, right? As opposed to me recounting what I already know about me, or retelling my history.
Right. Yeah. I did one of my own podcasts a while back, and I just did some Googling and said, how many books are there in the world? And there's billions. It's like, if you think about that for a second, and if your main source of knowledge is reading, for instance, well, how long is it going to take you to read all the books? Well, you'll never, ever get there. That's a silly question to even consider. So think about all the things you don't know just from that point.
Yeah. And that's where, too, when you catch yourself talking about, all kinds of things you don't really know about, you realize you are just reprocessing somebody else's telling.
Right. Or like you said at the beginning, their bumper sticker, build the wall, or whatever it may be. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Julie, it's been fascinating to learn about Talking Eyes and Bring It to the Table. And we will send everyone to all of your websites and your social media accounts. I can go through them, or you can mention them here if you want.
So websites, talkingeyesmedia.org and bringittoTheTable.org. And it's the number 2, bringittoThetable.org. So those are our websites, and you can find all our social through there.
Yep, right on the bottom of the page. We will put all the links in the show notes on YouTube and also wherever you listen to your podcasts. And I think we'll cut it there. And I appreciate your time, Julie.
Thank you. It's been fun. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate you for doing this.
Thanks so much. And we hope to talk to you soon. Good luck in coming months. Hopefully you can get out there again and bring people back to the table. Otherwise, we'll watch for the online version of it. So thanks.
Thank you for watching the Unity Now podcast. If you enjoyed our show, follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram by clicking the links in the description below. Bah!